So it's actually, hey everyone. You know, I've been forgetting that we haven't been playing our game, and I feel like we need to play it. I really do. Uh, and I had a different version of it, but since it's just the two of y'all, it's until Nozibele go. Why don't we play? Let me see. Let me give me a category. Two Southern women. We're gonna play Alabama versus South Carolina. That's what we're
Oh
doing.
Lord, don't pit us in no championship. So.
I got a perfect category. Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade. Today we are talking about ways to celebrate our ancestors. So I figured we're going to start out with a little game. So we have not done it in several months. So let me get my little timer here. And we're going to do our Black love. So we're going to do one specific category. And this is going to be about ancestors. Okay. So in this particular category, I'm gonna give you a little bit longer. I'm gonna give you 20 seconds. 20 seconds. I want you to give me 5 sayings that your ancestors, like your grandmothers, your aunties, or whoever in your family, somebody would say, like 5 sayings that you've heard in your family. So this is Alabama versus South Carolina. 5 sayings that your family would say. No ums, uhs, ahs, no filler words. 20 seconds, go.
Don't put a hat on the bed. I got pound a piece lips. Your grandmama never lie.
Weigh the percentages, pro and con. Don't sweep nobody's feet. I'll be there if the creek don't rise.
And I said,
oh, you said all of yours. I said that. I'm out.
See, that's what I'm saying. I was like, ooh, I had all these other ones, but then I said,
yeah, but let me put my other 2 in.
Okay.
Age ain't no cure. That was what my great granddaddy said, and I'll have to tell you the context of that. And he said, I don't know if you'll say this as you'll count this as a saying, but he would say when we got to his house, go down in the cellar and get me one of them Coca-Colas. You know, Coca-Cola used to have cocaine in it. And then when we say, granddaddy, how old are you? He said, old as my tongue, but not quite old as my teeth.
Okay, that's a new one.
Old as my tongue, but not quite old as my teeth. Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, because he couldn't speak. His teeth old as his tongue, but not quite as his teeth, meaning that until he was speaking. Is that what he means, or no?
I thought he meant, you're born with a tongue, but not teeth. You get your teeth later.
Oh, so. I was thinking that maybe, I don't know, when you can sort of speak for yourself, that's when you become a person, but I don't know.
Yeah, I'll have to ask around. What did
no, you're probably right.
Old as my tongue, because you always had your tongue, but
that's what she said, not as my teeth.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't think about that one.
People lose teeth too, so I was like,
yeah, that's what I was like.
I don't know exactly where to go with that. So yeah, but all right. So my other one was never put a wooden nickel in a piccolo. Now I had to do some deep, anthropological research to figure out what that was. I was like, don't put a wooden nickel in a piccolo. But apparently a piccolo is a jukebox. So the piccolo is both an instrument and it's what they used to call the jukebox. And as a matter of fact, the juke joint, some places they used to call them just the piccolo. Are you going to the piccolo Friday night? And so apparently people, when they didn't have money, particularly in the 30s and 40s, used to try to trick it by putting a wooden nickel in there, right? And to try to get it to play music so the party could keep on going. And so what I think she was saying is don't fake the funk. So don't try to pretend to be something you're not. So she would always be like, well, you don't go put that wooden nickel in the piccolo. And I was just like, well, okay, first of all, I had no piccolo. Second of all, I don't know what you're talking about. But I think she meant just don't try to be fake. Don't try to, in the process of trying to go out amongst your friends, don't be sitting there trying to get the thing all jammed up with a wooden nickel. So that was one. And then the other one was, she always used to say 2 hats get you a beating. And I was like, why would somebody be wearing 2 hats? I don't know. It'd be so I think my grandmother was an outlier. She had these crazy sayings, but I think that meant you would try to take on too much, or you beyond yourself, like, because I don't, because like I said, the times where people wear two hats are very, slim to none. And then, one time I was joking, I put two hats on my head, and she literally tried to beat me. But I think that she was thinking that I was just, thinking I'm above myself. But okay.
Interesting.
So here's one from my grandmother. I always talk about Gran on here.
Yeah.
When she wanted somebody to get out, leave, get gone, as we might say, she would say, you're gonna have to go. Let the dough hit you where the good load split you.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? And I was like,
that's everybody, grandmama.
That's
grandmama trying to get people to get out.
Where the good load split you. And with the age ain't no cure one, the context was when HIV AIDS became an issue in the United States, and we were visiting with my great grandfather. By then he was like 100 years old, and he had the news on, and people were like, that AIDS, oh, that's just it's scary, it's just something new, we haven't seen it before. And they say there's no cure for it. And I guess he was hearing was failing him or something like that. And he said, why y'all talking about that? Age. Everybody know ain't no cure. Age ain't no cure for it. Never was a cure for age. And so he was like,
he's right. There's
no cure for age. But he didn't understand when we were saying AIDS, not age. But I remember that to this day. When my knee started hurting, I'll say, oh, ain't no cure. Age ain't no cure.
That's true.
The one for me that I remember, okay, so y'all know that I'm a non-Southerner. I grew up in Los Angeles, but my grandmother would say all the time when my brother and I would be trying to like eat her out of house or home, she was like, y'all eating that like it's going out of style. She would say that over and over again, eating that like it's going out of style. And I just remember that. And then kind of a classic one I remember, and I don't necessarily remember my grandmother saying this, but I definitely remember hearing like, you don't believe fat meat is greasy. Cause like I will even say that to my daughter. You gonna learn fat meat is greasy. And they didn't grow up eating like beef and pork. So of course they were looking at me like I'm crazy. And no context for what I'm talking about. They're like, whatever. But good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade. I am joined with my guest, Dr. Kenja McCray, who is a professor of history at Clayton State University, and Dr. Corrie Claiborne. I always want to call her the other with the add an extra R in there, but Dr. Corrie Claiborne, who's an associate professor of African American literature at Morehouse College. And today we're talking about how we remember our dead. And so actually I think that was a good one to start out, of like ancestral sayings, or those things that we remember that are people that we grew up with, but that are now ancestors say, and that we continue to carry on those sayings. And I actually think that it's really good that we're just starting out with the two of you, because I had already thought that I wanted to start out with the two of you because you're Southerners for a very specific reason. And I wonder if we can start with you, Dr. Claiborne, specifically, is one of the things that I've always noticed about you and always admired and always have been really intrigued. Well, let me back up. Being from Los Angeles and not being from the South, not visited the South when I was a child in Los Angeles, I think we grew up with a lot of stereotypes of what happens in the South. And so we don't have a very good understanding. And so it wasn't until I'm a full grown adult that I moved to the South where I start to like interact with people and understand things very differently. So my mother wasn't a Southerner. She was born in Los Angeles. Also, my father was a Southerner. In a very interesting way, but he moved away when he was 16. So I think I had a very unique kind of upbringing. And so when I have met people along my journey as an adult living in the South, I've always been really intrigued by the way they negotiate the world, which is very different than the way that I was raised. So that being said, I know one of the things about you is that you're very connected to being a literature professor and very connected to your Southern roots and your Southern roots that come from South Carolina and your identity as a Christian woman, and then a Christian woman that has these conversations with me all the time about ancestors and these ways in which your family dealt with kind of the ancestral realm that I find it really interesting. So that's where I'm saying my perspective, I wouldn't have thought that or understood that as someone that's coming from California. And then I meet someone like Professor Claiborne, and I was like, she's really different than I expected. Because you can have these two pieces of yourself where in my mind, if you're a Christian, then you don't say anything about ancestors. And I learned very quickly living in the South, that's not necessarily true.
Right. And it's a very African sort of Christianity. And it's the same with New Orleans, right? Like, so much of what we think of as, practices that are Black, or, we talked about the second line and, all of these kind of things that, All Saints Day, which is coming up, All Souls Day, out of a Haitian context, it was Fête Ged, right? Like this kind of idea that you have a day in November when you honor your ancestors. I learned about that because it's in church. In church, we call out the name of our ancestors on November, the first Sunday in November.
Really?
Yeah, that's part of our Christian sacrament. Like when the saints go marching in, like literally, that is a song that people played at church. It's literally this kind of idea, like, we want to be in the company of our ancestors. And so what's so fascinating is ghosts are such a white Western people's idea. And I say that to mean we always knew people were dead, that there were, people went somewhere and they did something, but we never called them ghosts, right? Like that was never a word we used. We understood. That's why, when I told this story about how I watched, what was the one? It was The Exorcist when I was young. And my grandmother was like, you don't need to be watching it. Like, you don't need to be watching literally. And I was like, but you like all this scary stuff. You always talk about people coming back and talking to you and going da-da-da-da. Isn't that the same thing? And that demons and all that. She's like, no, and she always said, spirit is, that's your grandfather and your grandmother and your great grandmother, her grandmother. Anybody else you need to talk to, they're always here, right? And there was always this moment where I had to confront going into a white world, realizing that they had a different notion of Christianity, they had a different notion of spirit. We always thought that what made something your home, especially in the South, is because that's where your people are buried, right? That's literally a Congo proverb, right? Where your people are not buried, you cannot build your house, right? There has to be a connection with the dead in order for you to make anywhere your home. And even my cousin in California, people were surprised. His grandmother had moved out to California way again. His mother was born in California. He was born in California. He died and he wanted to be buried in South Carolina. And people were like, how is that possible? He doesn't know anybody. He was in his 40s, but he was like, that is where my people are. Like it was a sense that he would never rest. And even people, all of his family couldn't come from California to go to the funeral, but he was like, I have to be there. And I think that, so it's not so much the religion does something. It's not so much that the, talking about death does something, but it is the connection of this place that's home, that is where your ancestors reside, right? And I think that that's why I am so connected to South Carolina, because that's where my family is buried. When I die, that's where I'm going to be buried. So yeah, it's like a really deep thing that I think transcends. It's like a cultural thing that transcends like any specific religion or region, I think. Yeah.
And for me, that's the thing I think is powerful, because I didn't understand that growing up. And that's specifically why I said that. I think one of the things that we missed in the whole stories of Black people in migration and the Great Migration is the ways in which that fractured things, where my understanding of what it meant to be connected to your ancestors and to your homeland and your faith system and your culture was very different than when I'm talking to my friends that were raised in the South. And that would actually kind of makes me emotional when I think about it. Dr. McCray, I'm curious of your experience. So here's South Carolina experience. Tell us about Alabama, you growing up there.
That's an interesting question, because you know what? We've talked about this and published together a little bit about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're the first author on articles about uses of Ifa as a mental health intervention. And I remember when you interviewed me initially, when you were doing your research, and we talked about how there are antecedents to the more formal adoptions of forms of Ifa within African American communities. And you asked about ancestor veneration. And I remember my folks, they didn't have as coherent connections with the ancestors as Corrie is discussing. We were in Birmingham, Alabama, but we have a very close family. And I do recall that even my very Christian grandmother spoke of her ancestors in much the same way that Dr. Claiborne is speaking. So these expressions did not show up in our church. I grew up in the Church of God, not the Church of God in Christ, the Church of God. Mm-hmm. And those expressions of ancestor veneration that I experienced growing up were definitely more of a thing that was familial. So we took a lot of time to remember our ancestors that we knew. Their pictures were all over our house. And my grandmother would always talk of dreams where she communicated with her mother or communicated with her father. And it was really like they were there, and she really felt that they were trying to bring her a message. And once I started to learn about holdovers, Africanisms in African American culture, I started to see, wow, like this is not how my friends, European American friends talk about their relationship with the dead. And I really thought it was a holdover.
It's interesting because when you said the picture thing, I remember like my grandmother's living room. So it was like the kind of den and living room combination. And there were pictures all over. And I would always be curious about the different pictures. My grandmother would be meticulous about writing people's names on the picture, but not necessarily how we were related to the people. So like I have this picture right now that's on my ancestor shrine. My grandparents are sitting there. My grandmother's oldest daughter is sitting there, and it says like the sexy family or the amazing family or something like that. And there are people on the picture, and I have no idea. I have their names, but I don't know how they're connected to us. And that was like really important. Like when you would go to my grandmother's house, she's gonna pull out some pictures, and because you're little and you're not as with it on like how all these people are connected, and she's like, oh, this is your cousin, and this is your this, and this, and I'm like, wow. I even have this picture now and I remember this person that was my grandmother's friend. Her name was Effie, and I just remember as a child that I didn't necessarily, and I'm not trying to speak ill of the dead. I didn't like her as a child, but I don't know why I didn't like her. I just didn't like this woman. And it wasn't until like maybe like 5 or 10 years ago, I pull out the picture and Effie is on the picture and she's standing next to my grandmother and they look just alike. And I'm like, okay, so clearly this person is related to my grandmother because it's me and my brother in the picture and Effie and my grandmother standing there and they look, and I know it's not my grandmother's sister, but I don't know how this woman is related to my grandmother, but it has to be a close relationship because they look so similar. And I just think about, like, I'm always constantly connected to these pictures that I have that are like holdover from my grandmother's collection, and I don't necessarily know who the people are, but for whatever reason, I feel connected to them. And so some of them I end up putting on my ancestral altar, even though I don't know how those connections exist, because I know my family that I know is very small, but my actual biological family is massive. So there's tons of people that I don't know, but it just makes me think of the ways in which my grandmother wasn't talking about ancestors, and she didn't have that kind of language where she was talking about ancestral worship, but she clearly had this connection to the people in her family, and she wanted us to have that connection also.
But that's interesting. I don't know, like, for example, if they would call it worship, and this is the part where the Christian part comes in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a festival, it's a celebration of, it is a calling home, right? And an acknowledgement. I mean, I'm not, I don't really know that much about Dias de los Muertos, but the kind of idea that you go out and it's like literally, I mean, there are places in Africa where they literally get people out the tomb and then they like march them, right? Like, and they like, rewrapped them and whatever. And then they put them back and the family goes in and has lunch and eats with their ancestors, etc. And that's what I think of is more of a carryover. It's this kind of thing like that. I mean, the dead don't stay dead. Like, you have to talk to them. You literally have to clean off the grave. You have to, as if you're cleaning their house, as if like, I think the worst thing that you could ever do to somebody, and I don't think that this was worship for me, but it was just like, if you had guests coming over, or even if it's your family, you're not going to leave the room dirty. You're not going to forget to feed them or not bring them any food. You're not going to, like, literally this kind of thing where now we don't know who these people are. My grandmother could not imagine forgetting anybody, because they bring those pictures out, they tell stories, they have food, and it's almost like the person is there. So, that kind of idea, the saints come marching in. It's like literally they all come to be remembered. And I feel like that a lot of those things we've gotten out of, because, and especially I'll speak for my, Methodist church. I mean, we still do it. I mean, there's like a band or whatever, and they sort of say, the saints call out the name of somebody that you want to remember. But I don't think that it's the same kind of, no, we eat with them, we talk with them, we ask them, who's going to win this election. Like, we got to do all this other kind of stuff, like ask for guidance, like how can we rebuke this devil and get this other person, like all of that. I don't think we do it in the same way, unfortunately. Even I don't, because I like the same. I have pictures, I don't know who they are, and I think my grandmother would be. I pull them out though. I do pull them out, but I don't know. I don't have enough to tell stories about who they are to my like nephews or the next generation.
So I started to think about this whole idea of ancestral connection associated with that Netflix film, The Descendants, and that being very specific, because no one say, you're right. So I would use the word ancestral worship. That doesn't fit me.
Sorry.
I said veneration.
Some people will say veneration. some people will say elevation, some people will say remembrance, and some of that has to do with people's religious beliefs, and I think that that's fine. And so none of those words were said in the documentary Descendants, but the reality is what you were looking at is ancestral veneration, when you have these people from Africatown in Alabama that make this effort to pull the story back together about how their ancestors got here to the United States. And I mean, I think there was two things that stood out to me, Dr. McCray, when you told me, when you texted me and told me to look at it, is just the environmental piece and how they grounded that story in this environmental justice issue that we know that it often impacts Black communities. And then the other thing is the brother with the locks that was a direct descendant of Kojo Lewis, and him, just being this young brother and having his 3 daughters out there. And he was like, this is our heritage, and his own connection with the land and the community, I think, was important. And I'm wondering, what was the impact on the two of you when you saw the documentary?
I agree. I thought the piece about environmental justice, environmental injustice that's being done to the descendants of the 110 on the Clotilda, and the emphasis on structural inequity that's embedded in the economy, the economics of it, really set that movie apart. So, and it didn't lose, like you're saying, the pieces that have to do with honoring their ancestors, the residents of, or so the descendants in Africatown, honoring their ancestry. Because there's not too much, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying there are a lot of books, there are a few books about the topic, there are a few other documentaries, like I watched Clotilda, the Last Slave Ship, the National Geographic produced one. And I do agree that this theme of ancestral veneration and remembrance is embedded in most of those, if not all, that I have read or listened to or watched. But the Descendants really was a good take, because we cannot leave on the table the ways that the hardships that our ancestors faced in terms of the transatlantic trade and its aftermath really play into structural inequities that we face and deal with today. And I really like that take on ancestral remembrance and the ways that they persevered and overcame in their ingenuity. So I liked that documentary. I appreciated it.
What were your thoughts, Corrie?
And it was weird because I told you this. I saw like 3 documentaries in a row that were all about the Clotilda, and it was kind of interesting. And I will say that the first one, Africans in America, I thought was really good because it sat with the old people a little bit longer. And I appreciated the young sort of narrator, the person who's the descendant of Kojo Lewis and the Descendants, setting it out. But this kind of notion about how people, and they did this in the Descendants too, kept the story alive, but really what it meant to them in terms of how they developed strength around it in the face of all this racism and environmental justice, and then putting the I don't remember if this was in African in America or in Descendant, but talking about putting the highway right through their town, and that literally, like, it made this I remember this in High on the Hog too, but this kind of idea that it severed their people in a way that it also severed the story, right? Like when you put these people across the street, the amount of people who can remember when that highway didn't run through this neighborhood and this community is very limited. And it becomes this kind of thing that the storytelling is the medicine, right? The storytelling is the healing. And I feel like Descendants is getting at this thing like, okay, now we've unearthed the ship, and now we're talking about what can be done in terms of economically, especially using EJI as a model, which has brought almost $1 billion of revenue into Montgomery. If you can imagine what kind of change that would mean for Africatown and Mobile, but then how do you make sure that the descendants are the ones who benefit, right? That it's actually not just people like, oh, well, it's going to be the same people, white people, profiting off of this. And I feel like it is that call for the story that becomes really important. So the veneration for me, the power for me is that the story, that people can not only just talk about what happened and how Cujo Lewis got here, but from that point on, the way that they survived, the way that they kept community strong, sort of the practices that they have, and even in naming, right? I thought that was really, and I can't remember now, I'm getting my documentaries mixed up. So did they show in Descendants the sign with all the names of the people and where they came from, what tribes they were from? Oh, that's in another one. So that was really powerful because they have a historical marker where they list the 100 and they list what ethnic origins that they have. So if they were Yoruba, if they were Fon, if they were whatever, Dahomey, whatever they were. And it shows too how they had to even construct a culture out of all of these people that came there. And so I thought it was a really kind of interesting question about how they, this is like a Michael Gomez thing about how sort of being in the United States forced them to think about this culture that they were creating and to look at that in this place that was quote unquote late in terms of slavery, I think was really fascinating. And I think it speaks to the possibility of how people, knowing what the stories and knowing the cultures that people came from, it speaks to the possibilities of what people can do in the future. And I think that if you do tell that story, you won't be able to leave out Black people when it comes to actually, because I think they've already designed the park. They've already, thought about and they're doing this in Oklahoma too, but to less extent. But they've already thought about if there's going to be some kind of center, some kind of museum. I don't know if that's been designed yet, but I feel like there has to be this question of having everybody sit with these ancestors who kept this story alive. I think if they're going to find any way to build anything, right? Like, I don't think it needs to be anybody from outside telling them what they should do. I think they should literally lean on. So part of these things that we do when we call the saints in is that, we ask them for their input. And I'm not just talking about having community things. I think that like community, town halls where all kinds of people can come. It's literally like, okay, how did you construct your neighborhoods? How did you decide where to build your house? If before the road came through, what did the neighborhood look like? What was central? What would you need to make it feel like it was your home? So I feel like they just need to ask some of the older people. Yeah.
I was going to jump in, but I think since we got a historian on the line, we should let her do it. Just in case people don't know the story of the Clotilda, Dr. McCray, can you give us a quick history lesson?
So the Clotilda is considered the last slave ship to have come to the United States. It was sent to West Africa based on a bet by the Mayer family, Meaher, I think is the spelling of that. It's an odd spelling. And it was just like, I bet, even though the transatlantic slave trade is illegal and has been so since 1808, I could commission a ship and bring in slaves directly from Africa. So Mayer commissioned the Clotilda and commissioned Foster, is his name. Foster ran was the captain, and was able to go and purchase enslaved people in Dahomey from the king in 1859 and return in 1860 to Mobile, Alabama, the port of Mobile, Alabama, port city of Mobile, Alabama, with 110 captives that he had procured. I've read that Foster said that when he asked if he could buy captives, he was taken to a room that was full of thousands of captives in Dahomey and picked out the people he wanted to enslave and bring back to Mobile. So there was all this speculation about where the ship was, because the ship was burned to get rid of the evidence. The people were disembarked and the ship was burned. So that has been found. Divers have been able to locate that, and it's right off of an island where the Mayers had property. And so the 110 were sold and dispersed mainly around southern Alabama, but some of them were still in the Mobile area. They would have been enslaved until 1865, when, at the end of the Civil War, slavery became illegal. And the ones that were still in the Mobile area first approached Mayer and said, look, you did this to us. At least you could give us land, because, now we're destitute. Slavery's over. And we want to make a living for ourselves, but we think you owe us restitution. And he was like, why would I give y'all land? No. So, yeah, they pooled their resources together, bought land together, started a church together, built homes as a group, and their descendants evolved from that community, which has since been called Africa Town. So, and then the most, I think, famous of the 110 is Casola Lewis, because of Zora Neale Hurston's interview and the publication of Barracoon. What was that, in 2017? And then
2018,
something like that. Yeah,
I think it's 2018 and 2019. I'll find it out. Go ahead.
All right. And then there was actually another descendant that was living that Zora Neale Hurston knew about. What was her name? Do you remember?
Oh God,
it slipped my mind.
It was like
Lucy, but I
don't know what her original name. It's like Sarah or Sally something.
Something like that. Yeah. I've got it.
When it came out.
2018.
If you hadn't asked what her name was, it was.
Oh yes, Redosha.
Okay, Redosha. Okay.
Yeah,
here I am with the slave name. I can't come up with anybody's name.
What was her? What did they rename Redoshi? Redoshi. Is it Redoshi?
Something like I'll find it in just a second.
It was Sally. See, that's what I'm saying. I do the Sally or Smith or something like that.
Something like that, yeah. So yeah, but so the descendants, people were able to pass down oral histories in particular about this incident, this very notable incident. I was captivated by it because when I worked as an intern when I was in undergrad at Spelman, I had an internship at Alabama's Constitution Village in Huntsville, and I was doing work for them, research, and that's when I came across this story in a newspaper in Alabama, and I was like, "What?" And I've always wanted to know more about it, but when a professor from University of South Alabama, Dr. Joel Billingsley, approached me asking me about oral history, because that's really the main sort of um, technique that I use for uncovering and recovering histories of our community, our ancestors. She would just wanted to know about the technical side of it, right? And she was like, "I'm doing this documentary. It's called The 110." And I was like, "Yes," because this story has always fascinated me. So she actually grew up as an Africatown descendant of Casola Lewis, even though Sylviane Diouf is like the leading historian on the topic. Sylviane Diouf does not believe that they are blood relatives. So we explored this idea of fictive kin and oral history and what it meant to them in terms of being able to keep their ancestral stories alive. It's a really fascinating story. One last thing, when you talked about Dr. Claiborne, the Equal Justice Initiative and tourism and remembrance and public history in Montgomery, and how maybe Mobile could make that work for them, so that the descendants in Africatown get a very prominent space for remembering their ancestors, their story, but the city of Mobile gets it translated into language that they can hear, because a lot of people don't hear, well, this is the right thing to do, is the ethical thing. They hear bing, 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 dollar signs, cha-ching, right? So to, in a way, make it palatable, or something that they would be interested in, the powers that be in the Mobile area. So it's a tourism issue. Like Montgomery brings a lot of people who spend a lot of dollars in the city to see this history and experience this history, and we can do that too. Is fascinating for me, because I love and I see the value in public history, and you all have got my mind turning about how much of the work of public historians fits into the realm of ancestral remembrance.
And I think that it was shocking to white people how much people wanting to know about the history of slavery and mass incarceration would draw people to Montgomery. They legit did not think that was the case. And when I was there for Asala, it was really kind of fascinating to me, as somebody who worked in Auburn for almost 4 years, to see. I did not recognize Montgomery. Like, I literally didn't. And they were saying that there were people from up north who had been buying up some of the historic buildings, turning them into coffee shops and other kind of. There was this place that I went in. It's where Rosa Parks, where she worked in the. As a seamstress in what used to be a department store. They turned that into a whole Rosa Parks garden. There's this place called the Prevail Union, and it's like basically I Will Prevail. They have an art space where they were doing something of quilts of the incarcerated. They had this other kind, but I will say this, in all of the art, and then they had some murals, and it was like tucked away. But they were literally like, this woman from New York bought up like 10 historical buildings, and she's only renting them to people who want to do something that has to do with justice, but I was like, well, she should have just bought them and gave them to somebody else, which would have been a better thing. But at the same time, they're Black people, the mothers of gynecology. There's all this stuff that's popped up She bought a couple of buildings, including a house for the Wells sisters, including all this other kind of stuff, where she's trying to use the new interest in Montgomery to really bring economic justice for people through public history, through remembering things. So people are fascinated by this story. You leave the Legacy Museum and the Lynching Memorial, and you want to have more. So all of this stuff that's coming out, there are 3 new hotels that are going down. I don't think any of them are Black owned. So there is something that needs to be done. So if you think about, okay, all these people are going to want to come, what kind of hotels they can have, what kind of other kind of experience could you give them? The restaurants, there were 3 vegan restaurants in downtown Montgomery. There was all these other, like literally none of that was there. And so when they say that something like $1 billion of revenue been brought into Montgomery, which literally, when I say there was nothing there was nothing there. I know that Mobile has even more of a potential, billions of dollars. But what can happen is that money goes into, you have new hotels. The tax money goes into funding schools, which is still segregated. Black people will still be in the worst schools, and all the money ends up going to the white schools. And I don't want that to happen. Or, everybody's roads get fixed, but where the Black people still on a dirt road, right? Or everybody. So I think that partly, what I say is, I think it's all of this, but it's tied to the story. Because if you talk to the old people, they say, well, they live down this road. This is where they used to be. Well, okay, well, maybe that's where you need to build something so people can sit and contemplate under the same tree that Cujo Lewis did when he thought about going back to Africa. So whatever it is, building, monuments, walls, places to sit, places to eat, places to reside, Airbnbs, whatever. There's so much, I think, potential, because people want to know the story. And I'm, thinking about being from South Carolina, they did a study. They actually had to commission one, and they said there's $34 billion of potential revenue that can be brought into the Gullah Geechee community. 34 with a B, billions of dollars. And it's just about how to get people, because everybody wants to tell their story. Everybody's interested. It's like, how do you link that in? I think becomes the question.
Okay, so I'm gonna put on 2 of my hats. I'm gonna put on my undergrad in business, and I guess I still wear that hat as a businesswoman now, and my psychologist hat. And so when we talk about this, I mean, it sounds exciting. Like when you said, $34 billion of potential revenue off the Gullah Geechee culture. What I hear in those stories is making money off of the ancestral legacy of people of African descent in this country, and that oftentimes that money does not necessarily go back into African people's hands like you're describing in Montgomery. And that's the thing that bothers me. So like, even when we look at the Africa Town right now in Mobile and the surrounding communities, one of the things that the Descendants documentary talks about is how the Maher family, Maher, still owns a lot of the land that is surrounding there, and they're surrounded by like all this environmental toxins, like the Scott Tissue Company and these other companies that historically have spilled all this waste. And they looked at all the descendants and how many of the descendants had a cancer diagnosis, had either died from cancer or were survivors of cancer. And as of the documentary, which was just released, the Maher families, the descendants, still own that property. So their ancestors committed this crime. And at the time that their ancestors committed the crime, it was punishable by death in the United States. But they were able to get away with the crime, which I wish we had a lawyer on, because the interesting thing is, remember, the people are property. And so you have to document the fact that you own this property. So how all of a sudden did you have this new property? But that's a whole other thing. Even if they couldn't find a ship, that's a whole other topic that we can't talk about right now. But I am thinking about the fact that their descendants are still profiting off of the death and destruction of these people that they illegally enslaved. illegally and immorally enslaved. And one of the things, I don't know if y'all saw that at the end of the documentary, that they had put up that they had tried to contact the family multiple times and without any response. And so to me, that speaks a lot to this idea of like remembering our ancestral legacy. And then when somebody else thinks that it's valuable, that they will make money off of it. They'll make documentaries, or, they'll, put up coffee shops, or, come down, sell some property in New York that's, millions of dollars, and come down here and buy property cheap. And then they may seem like they're benevolent by only renting it out to these social justice causes, but they're not giving up anything. They're still making money off of it. It bothers me. It doesn't feel right for me.
It doesn't feel right, but it's one of those kind of things where you have a legislature, and this is one of the problems in Savannah, as we sort of talked about this before, is they don't give business license to Black people. So even if they did have the money, even if they did have them, so like this, I think Prevail Union has a liquor license. They won't give a liquor license to Black people, because I've seen that in other resort areas. Doesn't matter if everything is on board or whatever. So I think that it's a step. So you have to get, I don't say you have to, but I think that for all of these inequities that exist in terms of getting Black people to get their money, it might be that they have to sell it to white people. I remember Michael Harriot was saying when we talked after his thing, he bought a house that used to be a plantation house when he moved to, Georgia, but he didn't let them know he was Black, right? And I think there's a lot of times where it's gonna have to be on some kind of stealth, when, especially if you're talking about breaking, centuries old, thing to keep Black people out of the means of production. I think there might have to be something in between, unless you can figure out. I mean, the mayor, Steve, he's a Morehouse graduate. The mayor of Montgomery is Black. I don't know about the mayor. The mayor of Mobile is not Black, but I don't know about the city council and the other kind of the people who vote on what's going to come, how tax money is apportioned, all that other kind of stuff. I don't know like what their politics are, but when you have just from a municipal standpoint, a place where you have to trick them. So this white lady, she just was like, oh, they're like, this is a white lady. So they've been trying to get her out, right? Like she's bought all these buildings. They've been, trust me, the people in Alabama have been trying to figure out how to stop her from building things that are actually going to be for causes that are quote unquote liberal. And like I said, it's not ideal. It would have been ideal to just give over the place to Black people. But I think that an intermediate step, right? And the question is, like, when she dies, who's she going to leave all this stuff to?
So what I think we're speaking to, and again, I think this is a business, economic piece, and a psychological piece, is economic terrorism.
Right.
So
who's the terrorist? So
I mean, I think we can, that's layered. I think we can look at governments. I think we can even look at people that come in with this kind of beneficent liberal perspective, but what they're intending on doing is profiting off of the backs of Black people in our ancestral heritage. And that's, to me, the thing that we have to think about, because I think it's important for us to talk about ancestral celebrations and our heritage, but we also have to talk about the ways in which that people think that they should make money off of that. For example, I remember going my first experience in a dungeon, an enslavement dungeon, was in Ghana. And as we walked in, and the folks didn't know any better, but as we walked in, so you got 300, as I went on a massive tour. So it was like 300 Black people from Los Angeles, predominantly. And people that are coming back to the continent for the first time. And this is before it was popular. This is 1996. And there are people lined up outside of the dungeon with little vending tables. You know how, like, when you go to the Malcolm X Festival or something, and people have the vending tables where they're trying to sell stuff, and then they got a little sign. I still have the picture to this day that has, you know, cold soda, and this is before cameras, digital cameras, so it was like, you know, Kodak film sold here. And I remember everyone being in a rage, like, how dare you, how dare you try to sell us something,
Right.
that is not the appropriate time. And even years, you know, 20 something years later, when I went to Corrie Island, off the coast of Senegal in 2019, I mean, I had the same thing where they have, you know, they have the tourist things and they're trying to get you to buy anything. And I just, you know, made it clear, like, I'm not here to buy anything. That's not what's going to happen, you know, when I'm going to see these spaces. And I think that's the struggle with that ancestral piece, is being able to go back and see these places and remember the ancestors, but then also people will think that that's a space where they should make money.
I mean, every museum I've ever been to has had a store, has had something when you leave. The National Museum of African American History, Culture, all of those, they do have a store. And the reason why they do is because people want to take something with them. And you can't take a piece of whatever. And I think it is also to keep the narrative. So one of the things that is, I'll just use EJI as an example. One of the great things about them is that the money that they make actually goes to help Bryan Stevenson and his lawyers fight for people who are on death row, advocate, like, literally, because they work for free, right? Like, so it is literally, this is how they're making it possible to hire lawyers, fight laws, tell this story to other people, go out and put up. I went to the marker in East Point of 2 lynching memorials and stories I didn't even know, right? About how they dragged this young boy out of what used to be the jail on Main Street and lynched him, right? For just looking at a white girl. And another man, they lynched him in the Sumner Park. And it's one of these kind of things, like, no, we need to have those stories. So if me going and buying, I think I bought another copy of Ida B. Wells's on lynching, and then I bought a copy of something from Bryan Stevenson, and I think I got like a mug or something. If that mug that says EJ, Equal Justice Initiative, and these 2 books help fund, you know, the project of memory for other things, then I'm okay with that, right? Like, I don't see that as something that, oh, well, you should never just sell anything. And it's not exactly when you come out. It's like you literally have to go around the corner, down the whatever. But they do have one. The same with the National Museum, like on the first floor, and their thing was packed. But again, people want to buy books. They want to have calendars. They want to celebrate the art. And I think that's important because you don't want the memory to die. It's just like why you have all the pictures of your ancestors, even if you don't know their names. You have to sometimes do that. For me, the more difficult thing is, you know, taking pictures where people are smiling in them, and they're very clear, right? Especially when you go in the lynching memorial, you can't talk loud. This is not a celebration. Don't be in here sitting on top of the slabs or whatever, with people's names of people who were lynched, right? This is not a fun, you know, this is not supposed to be there. You're supposed to be contemplating the very reality of what these people went through. So they're very clear about that. And so I have a harder problem with almost taking pictures in the moment. I'd rather sort of buy something after I've come through and I've paid reverence once I get on the outside, as opposed to, you know, just, I feel like I'm not sitting in perfect. It's like I wouldn't take pictures in church, really, although I have, but you shouldn't, right? So
I was waiting on this to come up, this topic, and there are a few thoughts that I have about it from the side of a historian, from the perspective of a historian. taking the position that our culture, our history, our ancestral inheritance shouldn't be bought and sold is, I think it is noble, but taking a hard line is, I think, naive, because this is we're living in the belly of the capitalist beast, and somebody's buying and selling it. And a part of intervening, like EJI, like Brian Stevenson, in terms of ownership, is a way of taking control, is a method of taking control. Taking ourselves out of the equation completely is not necessarily the most helpful position, because being on the side where the sausage of history is made, somebody is going to find that this story hasn't been told, because that's what we have to do as historians: mine all the data and figure out what stories need to be told. And somebody's going to figure out that story needs to be told. And the way inequity works within, systemically within, say, the academia in the field of history, is the girlies at the top 10 institutions are going to have way more power and way more support, economic resources to tell those stories. So a part of it is about who tells the story, and we need people who think like you with a business mind to help us take control of telling those stories. A lot of this work is done through local organizations, and so when you go to the National Memorial in Montgomery that EJI has set up, they tell you exactly how you can get involved with local groups that recover these stories of lynching, and how you can, lobby your public officials to set aside space and all this kind of stuff, procure space. I am with Asala. You mentioned Asala, Corrie. I didn't get to go this year. This year, I chose not to go, and everybody comes back and tells raves about Montgomery and their historical tourism. And you can join, right? I know you can join. You can join, Corrie, because you went to the annual conference.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I would love.
Just so you know, but I know I
I know.
can't. But I'm not. So, is this from the Atlanta chapter? You trying to do a plug?
Yes. How did you know? Yes, I want y'all to join the Atlanta chapter, which is also joining the national. But I mean, I'm saying, if you want to do the work, a lot of the work is being done there, including fundraising. There is a lady involved, Candy Tate. She raised millions to help restore Fountain Hall, our ancestral, legacy at Fountain Hall, where W.E.B. Du Bois had his office, right? And she, this is where decisions are made about where the money goes and how we can lobby, certain officials to make sure that the zoning is there or that the permits are given, right? And so, I guess my last statement is, don't talk about it, be about it. And taking yourself out of the equation and say, I'm not selling this, period, does not mean it's not bought and sold.
Yeah, and I will say, and from the Gullah Geechee part, they've recognized that we talk about environmental racism, environmental impact. The best way to shift what's happening about environmental impact and environmental sustainability is to work on cultural sustainability. Because what they've realized is that you can make something a sanctuary, like declare it as like a wetlands or something like that, as a site that people can't develop on. But if it has a cultural heritage per United States government, you can declare that area also an area that you cannot build on because of the cultural heritage. So it could be both of these things. You can protect stuff, you can protect, clean up the rivers and lakes and the waters. But the way to do that for a lot of people, and the argument is, especially if you don't have this whole kind of environmental study, is that you can talk about how, like, the culture. So for sweetgrass basket makers, if you keep on putting up areas, private neighborhoods, and they can't get to the grass to make the baskets, then you're telling them that they can't practice their culture. So there has to be access. You have to give them access per law to these places. The same thing with burial grounds, right? Like, with a lot of people don't realize that they can't keep you from your ancestors. We know that, especially in South Carolina, they'll just put something on top of it, but they have to preserve. So what South Carolina does, they just push the headstone off to the side, so you can walk around the parking lot, but they're not able to throw it away or get rid of it. But then this other kind of question is, okay, well, if you know this is where your ancestors are, what claim do you have? And I think that is kind of conversations that are going to come per descendant, per like all the stuff that we're talking about, because we can't forget that those are where the ancestors are. So
yeah. No, that's interesting, because you remember you took me to that church in South Carolina where you see all these Black people's headstones that are just lined up against the walls, and I'm like, what in the world is going on? What is going on here? So that was like, it's real crazy. Okay, we're at after 1:00, so I guess we need to wrap up. And Dr. McCray went off the screen, so final word. I feel like we went all around. I don't know if we necessarily appropriately addressed, because our topic was supposed to be celebrations, and we went into another area of it, but we're supposed to talk about how we celebrate the dead. You're on mute. Come off mute, Corrie.
I'm just talking. But what we're doing, this is part of celebration, is you sit there and you talk about your ancestors. I mean, we didn't have any food, and we don't have no food to leave them. But I think we did exactly what you're supposed to do. Like, you call on them, you call their names, say we haven't forgotten, that we talked about what we're going to do to help keep their memory alive going forward. I think that is what, this moment is, right? So whether or not it's ritualized in a way that we want it to be, I think that the idea of the practice is still there, right? That we cannot forget. Yeah.
Okay, so me, the queen of loving Black foodways. We got to talk. That I think that needs to be our closeout. So, in terms of ancestral dishes, the things that you remember, what's like something ancestral that like you either remember, really love, but you don't necessarily know how to make, or something that you still make because it's something that your ancestors made?
Well, I mean, it's that's the thing. Like, all our food is soul food, is African American food. It is the same food that we all eat. But what I will say is that I don't make this, Sam makes it, but Hoppin' John, the way my ancestors made it, with red sea island peas, red peas, pigeon peas, instead of black eyed peas. Black eyed peas, I think, is a late invention, because when people left the South, the red pea was not easily accessible, so they substituted it a lot. And when they went out west, they substituted it a lot for black eyed peas. But if you ever have the chance to have Hoppin' John with the red sea island pea in it, you should, because that to me brings me back to my people who invented the recipe very, I think, specifically. So
What about you, Nozibele?
I had a question. So, are you saying that pigeon peas come from the sea islands? Because I always wondered that.
Well, no, they don't.
Okay.
But the specific field peas that they use, I haven't seen them anywhere else necessarily. So you see something very similar to other people's pigeon peas, and even in the Caribbean, but the one that comes from the Sea Islands looks very different. So, in my opinion,
Wow,
tastes very different. It's very good.
I've got to have that. I've never tried that before. Yep. And so, I'm sorry. What were you asking?
Around before New Year's? Maybe that's another celebration we can talk about. This is the New Year's emancipation, which were Emancipation Day celebrations around cleaning house and all that. But yeah,
Yeah. I tried purple whole peas one time. I like that because they're like smooth. It has a nice creaminess that I appreciate.
because black eyed peas is a very specific taste, and it makes things muddy too. So it's not. It's when you try another kind of field pea, cowpea, it's like a totally different taste.
Yeah, used to have to hull purple whole peas. That was one thing that we had to do. We did with our grandmother on Saturday nights because she would usually make them for a Sunday dinner.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I've never had that until I don't think I ever saw those as a child. I had them as an adult. I just saw them one day and I was like, this is interesting. Let me try it. And I was like, oh, I like this taste. Yeah.
Yeah.
But what we're doing is a dish. You know, I said we were gonna close out on a dish. Like, what's an ancestral dish you still make?
That I still make.
Or that you remember.
Yeah. I think I remember a lot. I'm not struggling because I can't make everything, but because there's so much. I think although I have lost I didn't take on the cooking as much as others in my family, so I cannot cook all those specialties. But the thing that I really cooked a lot when my children were little and growing up and needed a hearty meal was grits, cheese grits especially. We have had grits multiple times a week for breakfast, especially salmon patties and grits. I think that's one of our favorites as a family. One of my favorites is still okra and tomato and succotash, which my grandmother called gumbo. And I think we talked about this because gumbo is okra. No, well, you can take off from that point, but gumbo means okra, and so it was an okra forward dish. A lot of people call it different stuff. I think the Gullah Geechee people call it okra soup or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in Alabama, they called it gumbo. In northern central Alabama.
Got it. I was just thinking about the things that I do. I do stuff that I actually didn't realize that were connected to my ancestors because both of my grandmothers cooked very well. One of them got sick when I was 10. So my memories of what she cooked aren't long. But a consistent thing that I do, so my grandmother, when she would say we was eating like we going out of style, she used to make cooked apples, bacon, and cooked apples, bacon, and toast. And so that was just like her thing. Like if on a Sunday morning she would do that. And so I'm really big on cooked apples. I love cooked apples. Family love cooked apples. And so I will do that on a Sunday morning. I usually throw some eggs in it. For whatever reason, my grandmother refused to make us eggs with that. And I don't eat pork bacon. So we do like fake veggie bacon, which people wouldn't care about. But I do that. And then my other grandmother's birthday is coming up this week. And she was well known for her pineapple coconut cake. So we do a pineapple coconut cake. I can't stand coconut, but I like everything else. Oh my gosh. As a little kid, I thought that the coconut was rice and like it was raw rice. And I would always try to scrape it off. I was like, why are they putting rice on the cake? I don't understand. So what we do now is we make a smaller version. We put part of that on the ancestral altar in honor of my grandmother, and we sprinkle that part with coconut, and then the rest that the family's gonna eat, we just leave it without coconut. So those are my I'll leave it as those two things. I mean, there's other things, like I said, that I do that I didn't realize that my grandparents did. And I call my aunt and I'll ask her like, oh, what did Granny used to do? And she would tell me these things. And I was like, oh, that's interesting because I cook those things too. So, all right, y'all. Well, again, I want to thank everybody. For those of you that are listening, do me a favor. If you haven't already done so, like this video, share. Even after we are done, if you put a comment in, that is all helpful, because, you know, we're always fighting against algorithms that if we were talking about, if we were naked, you know, all of us are on the 50 plus realm. But if we had on like some G strings or something like that, and we were talking some negativity and stuff, I'm sure that would go all over the internet, or the YouTube and the Facebook. But when we're doing stuff like this, we need a little help. So thank you for listening. I see, is it Casa? Aha. Kahasa? I hope I'm saying it right. Thank you. I see Sister Dawn. I see several people that are watching. So share this on your timeline for us, or like us. We are here every first Friday, and we have different discussions about all kinds of different things. And so meet us in December. We're going to hang out and have another conversation. Look forward to connecting with you. I want to thank my sister friends and colleagues that hang out with me every week. Today we had Dr. Corrie Claiborne, who is Associate Professor of African American Literature at Morehouse College, and my sister, Dr. Kenja McCray, who is a historian over at Clayton State University. So y'all take care.